Edwin, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me well? Yes, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, thank you. I'm Edwin Ackerman. I'm associate professor of sociology at Syracuse. And as Rebecca was referring to my sleep deprivations because my wife just had a baby on Sunday, so we're sort of in the thick of it. So bear with me a little bit, I guess. Um, okay, so what I want to do today is address the question of culture war politics and its relationship to class politics. And what I'll present here is very schematic, right? But I look forward very much to your questions and criticisms during the Q&A, right? So when we talk about the culture war, the standard explanation is that we're witnessing a conflict over values, right? This is sort of, again, the sort of commonsensical way in which we've come to talk about the culture war. James Davison Hunter, for example, who popularized the term, argued that these battles transcended traditional class politics, right? Now, surprisingly, many Marxist scholars agree on this point and view the culture war as what happens instead of class conflict. That is, as a symptom of class politics decline in the neoliberal era. Right? What I want to begin arguing today is, in a sense, exactly the opposite, that the culture war is a class war and that it is very much tied to neoliberalism. What I'll again schematically point out today is that you have, on the one hand, the traditional petit bourgeoisie. I will take some time in a bit to explain those terms, but the traditional petit bourgeoisie, that is small business owners who work their own means of production with minimal purchase of labor, find their material interest codified in conservative Republican discourse centered on an imagined benevolent patriarchal family unit. The new petit bourgeoisie, credentialed professionals who depend on often state-sanctioned degrees and specialized knowledge, find their interest represented in liberal democratic discourse organized around a project for an imagined meritocracy. This is class conflict. It's just not the one that we usually look for, right? So let me first explain why existing explanations, in my estimation, fall short here. I see on the one hand a culturalist thesis, and this is the dominant interpretation of the culture war, that presents sort of nearly tautological reasoning here. It claims that the culture war emerged from deep-seated religious tensions dating back to America's founding and intensified in the late 1960s as a reaction to secularization and counterculture. But this position can't really explain the timing of the culture war and its intensification. That is, why did the culture war, as we know it, erupt specifically in the late 20th century? Why not earlier, given that, per the culturalist thesis, this is rooted in deep-seated different visions of values? And it can't explain the oscillation that we often see with some of the topics that form part of the different camps here. Why certain issues, for example, gun control, can switch political balances over the past decades. I'm thinking here, for example, of the fact that Ronald Reagan, as governor of California, advanced significantly sort of modern gun regulation. Right? Now, more fundamentally, the culturalist approach presupposes that certain issues, therefore, are intrinsically conservative or liberal. Since it assumes political disputes stem from long pre-existing cultural values, by design, this framework cannot investigate the class dimension of the conflict. The culture war, from this perspective, could not be anything but cultural. Meanwhile, Marxist interpretations do connect the culture war to political economy, but they see it as symptomatic of class politics absence. Right? Barry Anderson, for example, has written that the culture war is a sort of hyperpolarization, the byproduct of the firm consensus over the free market that existed within both parties' political elites. The origins of this particular pairing of consensus over economics and heightened polarization over cultural issues relates to the declining strength of organized labor and the increased strength of the business class, right, as the post-war compromise comes to a halt. With the working class out of the picture, a sort of mass apathy over economic issues lent active minorities, according to Anderson, a power beyond their numbers to advance cultural and identity-based demands. Right? A bit earlier, Frederick Jameson, for example, argued a similar point. For him, the postmodern age dissolved working class political cohesion. The culture wars were symptomatic of the post-industrial transformation of capitalism. Or more recently, Wolfgang Streeck has argued in the same direction. As he puts it, the constraints on capital that upper classes were forced to endure post-1945 in order to become politically acceptable are ending. In the context of stagnation and recurrent financial crisis, the democratic compromise is eroding, and in its wake, politics as a series of struggles for redistribution is sterilized, lending therefore space for struggles over culture, identity, and morality to take center stage. In other words, these interpretations focused on the present-day absence of working-class political subjecthood mistakenly, I think, views the culture war as symptomatic of class politics decline rather than its transformation. For a sector of left thinkers, the intensification of the culture war is then explained as the product of an elite consensus over neoliberalism that evaporated class politics. That neoliberal consensus doesn't exist anymore, I should point out, and yet the culture war rages. So that sort of begs the question again of how to think about the relationship between the culture war in the U.S. and class politics. And here is where I want to sort of step back and think a little more conceptually, drawing particularly on Poulantzas's conceptualization of the petite bourgeoisie, which I think can help us think through its historical development, particularly during the neoliberal period, and the increased tensions between traditional and new fractions of this class. So by traditional petit bourgeoisie here, referring to those who own their own means of production but work it themselves, right? Tends to be small business owners, sort of shopkeepers, independent contractors with minimal purchased labor, right? That is, the surplus appropriation doesn't come significantly from the exploitation of wage labor like the bourgeoisie, but from working their own property, their own means of production, often with family labor or in a context related to family. Now, Poulantzas, interestingly, outlined some of their ideological characteristics in a sort of, or ideological proclivities, I should say. Pointed out, for example, that this class, the traditional petit bourgeoisie, has a deep attachment to the notion or the discourse around private property as the foundation of independence, embraces a type of economic liberalism that is combined with protectionist anxiety. That is, they support free markets, but demand state protection from big capital. There's a sort of pro-capitalism, anti-big capital dimension to the ideological proclivities of this class. A certain nostalgia for an idealized past of small producers, an anti-statism with exceptions, right? When we're talking about certain subsidies, and an emphasis on sort of family, local community, and traditional hierarchies. The new petit bourgeoisie, even in Poulantzas's discussion, is more complex, and in fact, I think needs a lot of refining, right? Because it's not simply referring to, let's say, white-collar workers, right? It's about the specific means by which they make their livelihood, right? Which it depends often and perhaps increasingly on some sort of state-sanctioned credential or a degree that certifies specialized knowledge. So the part that gets complicated here with the new petit bourgeoisie is that some credentialed professionals sell their label, sell their skilled labor as employees, right? So let's say teachers or nurses. But others work their degree as a means of production, right? Like lawyers or doctors in private practice, for example. What unites them here isn't social status, but that the method of acquiring their livelihood is based, again, on possessing certified specialized knowledge. Their ideological proclivities differ then from those of the traditional petit bourgeoisie. They espouse a meritocratic ideology, right? The idea that there's upward mobility to be pursued through credentials, not property. Identify with the distinction between mental and manual labor. There's a certain technocratic faith in expertise, in a sort of status-based individualism that's expressed through cultural capital. Now, there is a sort of comfort with state integration, right? Not only in the sense that many of them can be state employees, but in the sense that their credentials are, in some sense, state validated. Right? Now, how do culture war positions translate this material interest into moral language? Right? As I'm trying to point out, I see conservative positions defending an imagined benevolent patriarchal family unit that fits the traditional family business model. If you go down the issues, I think you can find this element quite present. Right? Take abortion, for example. The opposition isn't just religious. It's about preserving the patriarchal family division of labor, essential to family business reproduction. That is, women's domestic and reproductive roles aren't separable from the reproduction of the business itself. Right? Gun rights discourse reveals, I think, this clearly as well. Yes, there's a rhetoric about constitutional rights, but if you listen to the framing, it's really about protection of property and family from both criminal threats and federal government tyranny. And this maps directly onto the independent producers' need to protect their means of production and their defensive posture towards state power that they don't control. Immigration opposition follows a similar logic. Since the traditional petit bourgeoisie doesn't benefit like corporate or big companies do from undocumented labor, they don't extensively purchase labor power for profit, that is, they perceive immigrants as tax strains or competitors. Now, to the extent that they do purchase some of this labor, you'll notice that their opposition on this particular front begins to relax. Now, liberal positions, on the other hand, are organized around a project for an imagined meritocracy. Reproductive rights, for example, are framed as a choice, enabling women to determine their life trajectory, that is, pursue education and careers. And this maps again onto this credential class investment in individual mobility through human capital accumulation. And here we need to be, particularly careful in how we dissect this discourse to pick out again how it codifies some of its class interests. But I think again some of these things begin to become clear sort of soon after kind of poking at them. Notice, for example, liberalism's support for diversity politics, while at the same time being hesitant about affirmative action. Why is this? I think diversity maintains the appearance of meritocracy, right? It suggests that the system works when successful minorities are visible, while affirmative action threatens meritocracy by acknowledging that outcomes aren't just about individual merit. Immigration politics here reveal the same logic. Liberalism is much more keen to support immigrants when they are portrayed as dreamers, as hardworking, as people who've earned their place through education and through striving. So this sort of humanitarian rhetoric conceals again this material interest in a system where cultural capital, for lack of a better term, determines sort of material benefits. Right? Now, the federal government, or the state rather, in a much more abstract sense, I should say, it functions for liberalism as the guarantor of meritocracy, at the very least, as the sort of entity that standardizes credentials, that gives them a legitimacy. The conservatives' family-based localism represents, from this point of view, sort of arbitrary limitations on individual achievement from this perspective. In other words, the state is the true unit of collective consciousness, whereas the family is a site of arbitrary limitations on the individual.
Edwin, your time is up, so just finish up.
Okay, I'll just make one last quick point here. Right? So these, to me, again, aren't arbitrary cultural positions, right? They're systematic translations of class interest. Now, one final point to close this, right, is that I see this conflict intensifying under neoliberalism, and I don't have time to develop the point here. Hopefully, the Q&A I will. But what I'm thinking about here is the particular way in which neoliberalism produced downward pressure on both fractions of the petite bourgeoisie, while at the same time putting working class politics outside of the political fray. And that, to me, is what helps us explain historically the development of the culture war and its intensification into the present. Okay, so I ran out of time, so I'll stop there, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. Bernardo, I think you're next in alphabetical order. I'll give you 15 minutes. I'll wave my hands at the end, okay?
Okay, fine. Well,
Introduce yourself.
Okay, first of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Bernardo Ricupero. I'm a professor of political science at the University of São Paulo, USP. I'd like to thank Rebecca and also say it's a pleasure of being part of this network and discussing these important themes. Well, the name of my talk is Olavo is Right. It's the culture war led by the Brazilian far right. So I'll do something very different from what Edwin was doing. It's more of a description, and we might afterwards think about implications of what I am talking. Well, I begin with kind of an image. In the mass manifestations that took place in 2016 that led to the impeachment of the then president, Dilma Rousseff, placard was very common, and it said, Olavo is right. It's really curious that the multitudes that were dressed in green and yellow, the Brazilian national colors, that went to the streets to demand that Dilma Rousseff was removed from the presidency. So many of them gave time to talk about who was once an obscure philosopher, that is Olavo de Carvalho. Of course, there were different signs in these manifestations. And what is more important, probably, is to interpret, to think of these manifestations as part of a broader cycle that really began in 2013 with mass manifestations also, but that in the beginning were led by the left, by autonomous groups in the city of São Paulo, demanding that the bus fare who just had got higher, was stopped at that moment. It was interesting how police repression made these manifestations become bigger and bigger, and different demands or different frustrations would appear with them. And it's in a sense, in this environment, that the political right in Brazil, which was in a position, I think that Tatiana would talk about it also afterwards, kind of in a timid position, could reemerge. It's people even talk about of an ashamed right in Brazil, and it's linked to the military dictatorship that Brazil had from 1964 to 1985. It's true that also the coup d'état was also a product of manifestations for people who were asking for military intervention in that moment. But this 21 years that ended really with high inflation, low growth, and corruption cases made the military and the politicians from the right that were associated with the military highly unpopular. And then it's interesting to think how could a figure as Olavo de Carvalho emerge in this new environment that, in a sense, starts with the mass manifestations, and even you could talk about like the global protests of the beginning of the 2000s. I'll talk really fast about Olavo's biography, and this is interesting because Olavo is really Olavo de Carvalho, or Olavo as we say in Brazil, almost as someone who are intimate. But Olavo is really a baby boomer, and he really had the life of, or a lot of the problems of people who grew up in the 60s. He was once very briefly close to the Communist Party. Then he became an astrologist. And this was really important for him because he became interested in esoteric doctrines in a more general sense. And he converted to Islamic Sufism. Probably in this framework, he got to know traditionalism, which is a doctrine created by another person who converted to Sufi Islamism. That is the French René Guénon, who in the 30s, I think, that went to Cairo and everything. Well, I won't talk about traditionalism, but it's interesting that some figures from the far right, as Alexander Dugin in Russia and even Steve Bannon in the US, have some links to traditionalism. But in a general sense, traditionalism defends that major religions really are the expression of perennial philosophy, and they reject modernity. They also think about history almost in the sense of different eras, kind of based and inspired in the case system, the Indian case system, saying that, well, we began with an era of priests, and now we were really in our dark ages of slaves, something of the sort. Anyway, Olavo de Carvalho, already in the 70s, got disappointed with his brotherhood of Sufi and broke with it. And he reconverted to Catholicism, which was a possibility, taking into account really the syncretic nature of traditionalism. It's interesting that from then on, you could think about a new moment in Olavo's life and something that will have an impact afterwards. He talks about it in a book that he wrote that already in, I think, in 1990, he had kind of a revelation while he was attending a lecture on Epicurus, the philosopher, the Greek Epicurus. This lecture was part of more of a general series promoted by the cultural department of São Paulo, that was then a city that was ruled by the Workers' Party, the PT. But anyway, after seeing this, after listening and attending this lecture, Olavo said, I was aware of Brazilian intellectual decline, but I never imagined things could sink this low. And he says that he decided to write like notes during a sleepless night about the lecture. This, according to him, Olavo de Carvalho, led him to write a book that is called in Portuguese O Jardim das Aflições, or the Garden of Sorrows in English. Anyway, let me explain a little bit better what was happening then. As I said before, in 1990 or 1991, really the lecture was in 1991, PT was governing São Paulo city. And there were really this series of lectures on ethics. And afterwards, during already the government of Fernando Collor de Mello, who was a rightist, who won a very close election, there was a campaign for ethics in politics. What Olavo de Carvalho says, and this was kind of his revelation, that he realized that all of this lectures were really part of a great plot from intellectuals that were leftist intellectuals to gain control of Brazilian political and cultural life. And he says that this was really the cause of this is what he and other far-right authors call Gramscism. It's interesting that really during the 90s, when Olavo de Carvalho had moved to Rio, he will write 3 books that I think he considered the most important of his books. One in 1994 that's called The New Era and the Cultural Revolution. Another one in 1995, which is this Garden of Sorrows. And in 1996, another book which is called The Collective Idiot, The Collective Idiot. During this time, Olavo de Carvalho also began to write opinion pieces in important newspapers in Brazil. This was during the government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was someone many of you may know, who was a dependency Puritanism, but afterwards, as a president, he kind of opened the way for neoliberalism in Brazil. Basically, what Olavo tried to formulate in these books, and more in the New Era and the Cultural Revolution, is really the idea that after the failure of armed struggle in Brazil in the 60s, the left had changed their tactics. They had learned about Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, and instead of a direct attack, in Olavo's words, they decided to do a psychological sabotage. Or even in his crudest terms, he says the Gramscian revolution relates to the Leninist revolution as seduction to rape. And it's interesting, it's well known how Gramsci is really an author that a lot of different sectors of the far right is very interested and writes about and do different things related to Gramsci. But more important than this is to note that what really made Olavo de Carvalho someone important was the internet. During the 1990s, he began a blog. But in 2002, when Lula was elected president for the first time, he even started a platform which is called Unmasked Media, that was kind of a place where different figures from the right, new liberals and conservatives, as Olavo could kind of develop their criticism of the left and mainly of PT. And kind of Olavo's persona had a big appeal in the internet in the sense that he's someone who he's dead now. He used to curse a lot and do things of the sort. Interesting that he kind of became a mainstream figure in that time. So already in this new moment, Olavo publishes a book that is called The Minimum You Need to Know to Not Be an Idiot. And he's published by a big publishing house in Brazil. Yeah, he becomes important in another sense. What we can say in a more general sense that this rise of Olavo using the internet coincides with the governments of PT. In the sense, the left was becoming the establishment at that moment, and Olavo and other far-right figures could pose as even subversive or even people with an appeal of questioning order in a sense. And when finally in 2018, Bolsonaro was elected president, we could say that there was a kind of a culmination of all this process. Just after Bolsonaro's election, Bolsonaro decided not to address the public as normally is done, like talking to the media and news, but via Facebook, he talked directly to his followers and to Brazil in general. And it's interesting that he had 3 books next to him. These books were the Bible, the Brazilian Constitution, Winston Churchill's Memories from the Second World War, and this All You Have Had to Know Not to Be an Idiot. How to make sense of all of this? I think I'm already finishing. Well, we could even think that, like, ironically, Olavo de Carvalho, who was a critic of what he and other far-right authors called Gramscism, got involved in culture war, and he was successful to a certain sense. And we could even think afterwards of Bolsonaro's government, but I won't talk about it. But I think that if you go further and think, probably this is really what is more interesting, but I didn't develop really in my paper. We don't really have nothing hegemonical in this situation, in the sense that Olavo de Carvalho mainly was always a reactive figure. Mainly what he did was reacting to what he thought was the dominion of the left in Brazilian culture. More than this, it's interesting that I see Trump, what is called Trumpism, in a sense like a sign of the crisis of the neoliberalism. On the other hand, what is called Bolsonarismo, neoliberalism is a very important part. And even if you think about what André Singer, a political science scientist, calls the weak reformism of PT, this isn't really nothing comparable to a hegemonical project. So I would really say that we're really living through an hegemonical vacant, and this might be more interesting. Sorry, I was really fast, and sorry for the English and all what is being so fast.
Thank you very much. Cihan, I think you're next. And introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. I am Cihan Tuğal, professor of sociology at UC Berkeley, and I will argue today against temptations to trace the violence of the last 2 years, either in the Middle East, either directly to American imperialism or to ideologies such as Zionism and Islamism. A synthesis of the world systems perspective with structural Marxism offers a stronger account of the most fatal and destructive phase of the global right-wing surge so far. world system sociologists have been warning for at least 3 decades that the decline and ultimate termination of global American hegemony would bring about wars and revolutions, which could only slow down through the creation of a post-American world order. However, only a structural Marxist analysis of regimes and societies can account for the specific responses of each country and region to this inevitable chaos. Both Nikos Poulantzas and the early Ernesto Laclau theorized fascism as a movement-based authoritarian regime type in contrast to other authoritarianisms. And these are conservative monarchies, military dictatorships, Bonapartism. In contrast to these, fascism relies on continuous mass mobilization. And both theorists also pointed out that fascism necessarily lacks the tools to satisfy the economic and social needs of the strata it is itself mobilizing, since it preserves the sanctity of private property. Even though it has a relatively more anti-capitalist, quote-unquote, left wing, fascism ultimately serves the capitalist class. Yet since the people, the subordinate strata, are mobilized, unlike in other forms of right-wing dictatorship, their energy needs to be turned outwards and inwards in violent ways to prevent this energy from coming back to bite the capitalists. Combining world systems analysis with Poulantzas, I argue that whether authoritarian tendencies, even mass authoritarian tendencies, culminate in violent movements depends on, first, movement dynamics, second, accumulation regimes, and third, each nation's place in world systemic dynamics. We can understand why the Israeli and Syrian regimes are the closest cases to fascism only if we unpack all three dynamics. And my paper studies the roots and current dynamics of the Israeli and Syrian regimes to demonstrate the interplay of these three dynamics. The Likud-led bloc is the trailblazer in the global far-right turn. This Israeli bloc is neither a straightforward outcome of Zionism nor a simple instrument of American imperialism. We can make sense of this bloc only by analyzing it, and now this is the part I want to emphasize, as a contingently articulated response to the crisis of global capitalism and inter-imperialist rivalry. Neither Zionism nor even Likud's version of it was fascist to begin with, if fascism is defined in the sense specified above. Inter-movement rivalry and a crisis in the accumulation regime interacted to push Likud to the extremes, and I go into the details of the local accumulation crisis in the paper. However, not even that sharp turn to the right would necessarily amount to the violence we are now witnessing. The ultimate trigger was two interrelated manifestations of the world hegemon's decline. The first of these was the incompetence of the liberal Biden administration and its lack of vision. And the second manifestation was the far-right Trump administration's inconsistent mixture of evangelical Christianity with outright oligarchic extractionism. The US had certainly always been pro-Israel, which misleads many interpreters to see continuity between now and the past support of Israel. But Biden's, Trump's, and the current centrist liberal intelligentsia's tacit approval of a genocide constitutes a clear break with precedent. It is true that Zionist donors, evangelical extremists, American-Israeli military partnerships, and the memory of the Holocaust have always prevented a full criticism of Israel in the American mainstream. However, even as late as the Obama presidency, pro-Zionism meant aligning Israel's interests with an orderly American control of the Middle East, not giving a blank check to violence. Still, not even the declining world hegemon's complicity exhausts the picture. As important is the lack of an alternative world hegemon, which I will discuss at the end of my talk. Outside of Palestine, the major surge in violence in the region has occurred in Syria. Of course, not to the same extent. One maker of this violence was the Iran and Putin-backed Assad dictatorship. increasing inter-imperialist rivalry and American failures in Iraq and Afghanistan gave the far-right regimes in Iran and Russia the sense that there was an opening, which they used by shoring up the Syrian dictatorship at any cost. The counter-violence came from the jihadis, who were backed by several Western and Middle Eastern regimes led by Turkey. Salafi jihadis are not exactly quote-unquote fascists, but my contention today is that they have been moving in this direction as a result of inter-imperialist rivalry during the era of global hegemonic decline. So again, what I want to emphasize overall in this talk is that it's not imperialism on its own or movement dynamics as isolated from world capitalism, but the interaction of inter-imperialist rivalry with movement dynamics that produces the results we have been observing in the last 2.5 years. The rise of Salafi jihadism has its roots in the disappointments with the Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood line of Islamization, which was based on patient, slow, mostly nonviolent, I wouldn't say exclusively nonviolent, but mostly nonviolent, mass organizational and theologically flexible work. Varieties of Salafi thought had existed for centuries and took many organizational and intellectual forms, ranging from the scholarly Puritanism of Ibn Taymiyyah through the top-down Puritan Islamization of Wahhab, and to the progressive Salafism, like the sort of left-ish Salafism of modernist intellectuals such as Muhammad Iqbal. Salafi jihadism broke with these precursors and competitors, not simply with its more insistent emphasis on violence, but also with its splinter-prone, Foucaultist-like cell organizational structure. With its tight cell structure and fanatical Puritanism, Al-Qaeda indeed gave a lot of damage to its enemies. So Al-Qaeda was the leading force in Salafi jihadism for 2 decades. However, when it came to constructing rather than destroying its extraterritorial ambitions of a worldwide Muslim empire, kept it in a realm of fantasy. Unanchored by durable political and geographical institutions, Al-Qaeda and similar organizations whipped the American empire into its own frenzy, pushing both sides into a global and indiscriminate killing and vengeance spree. Until the 9/11 attacks, the violence and counter-violence occurred in pockets, rather than spreading to entire national territories, let alone broader regions. The neoconservatives were decisive here in that they used September 11 as an excuse to fundamentally change the game. And this can't be emphasized less, even though I'll just mention and discuss it in passing here, how they made a break with liberal imperialism. Invading first Afghanistan, then Iraq, they dropped much of liberal imperialism's civility, apparent civility, and appeals to the rule of law, and resorted to unabashed extractionism. However, despite all of this aura of triumphalism, 21st century American victories proved deceptive. The neoconservative assault was successful in extraction and enriching Western oligarchs, so I wouldn't call it a total failure, but it was not successful in securing durable pro-Western rule in either Afghanistan or Iraq, let alone shaping the broader region along American desires. Yet another reason to avoid too much emphasis on glorious American imperialism. Worse for Pax Americana, its destabilization of the region intensified popular frustration with the reigning dictators, most of whom were pro-Western, with important exceptions such as Assad. The frustration ultimately boiled over into the Arab Spring. Since the uprisings lacked clear programs and mass organizations and leadership, the Western world saw in them an opportunity for further control, with Turkey, the Turkish AKP regime, acting as the proxy. The failure of the export of the Turkish model was a watershed for the Turkish AKP and the region. The AKP abandoned its soft power approach and started to cooperate with the Saudis and the Gulf monarchies in arming jihadis. And here's something very interesting happened. The AKP shifted toward the world of jihadis, and the jihadis shifted towards the center organizationally, not ideologically. Offshoots of Al-Qaeda coalesced with Saddam Hussein's ex-generals and ex-officers to found ISI, which later became ISIS. With that coalition turning into a merger, a new era began in the Arab world. Breaking with established Salafi jihadi organizations' unreflexive Foucaultism, ISIS was giving hints of a move towards a more classical fascist path. Today, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, an ISIS offshoot, spearheads the taming and mainstreaming of jihadism, as well as the nationalization of the Salafi jihadi mission, even though it is still flanked by international fighters, which complicates its dethorning. From HTS control over Idlib, a relatively marginal Syrian town, to the takeover of Damascus, speculations abound regarding which Western powers guided, trained, and armed the jihadis. And here is, where most of, left-wing anti-imperialist criticism is focused. And I'm not saying this is important, but regardless of the exact enabling actors of this Damascus takeover, a movement dynamic was really crucial in these years, and that is the merger of the Salafi jihadi line and the Free Syrian Army of this civil war. The Free Syrian Army was the Syrian version of the patient, mass organizational, and theologically flexible Muslim Brotherhood line. Both the cadres and the strategies were combined. And this taming and mainstreaming of jihadism paved the way for the tacit global approval of the ethnic cleansings of 2025, where close to 10,000 people died from among primarily the Druze and the Alawites. So I'll wrap up with some thoughts on China. So China is the absent giant in the room, basically, more than an elephant, but marked by its absence rather than suffocating the oxygen in the room. China's unwillingness or incapacity to act as a new world hegemon reinforces most of the dynamics I have been covering. Its hands-off messages regarding the Middle East appear to align most strongly with democratic common sense. If you read the documents, I mean, people don't pay attention, but Chinese officials have been saying the most democratic things regarding the Middle East. But these hands-off approaches end up sidelining the Chinese state in inter-imperialist conflict. If Arab states could build autonomous positions and trajectories, as some Chinese experts hope, this could potentially sideline Western, Turkish, and Russian imperialisms and indeed help China emerge as a quote-unquote reluctant world hegemon, the only major capitalist power willing to increase consent at the expense of force in the Middle East as far as things go now. But due to complex structural and ideological reasons that I can't unpack here, I can unpack some of them in the Q&A if you want, China cannot live up to this potential. It is structurally barred from doing so. And this inability further strengthens fascistic actors in the Middle East. In the absence of civilized progressive mass movements and a new world hegemon, violence is bound to spread and intensify.
Perfect. Cihan, you have the timing down.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Tatiana, you're up. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Hi. Hello, everyone. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm Tatiana. I'm a professor of international relations at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, which is the southmost state in Brazil. So we're very closer to Uruguay and Argentina than to São Paulo, for instance. The work I'm presenting today is titled The Architect of a Terribly Christian Nation, Damares Alves and the Radical Rights Project for Brazil. This ongoing research explores the political trajectory of Damares Alves, who is an evangelical pastor, but also a key figure in Brazil's radical right, as she is the former Ministry of Women, Family and Human Rights for the Bolsonaro government, and currently she's a senator in our parliament. And I'm thinking of her as a critical case study for understanding how both gender and religion are weaponized in Brazil, and how this weaponization of gender and religion in Brazil can also help us inform and understand contemporary global right politics. So to do so, I conduct a thematic analysis of her autobiography, which is titled It All Starts in Childhood. And I argue that Alves strategically reframes a deeply reactionary political project as a non-negotiable moral imperative, which is rooted in the protection of Brazilian children. Ultimately, I try to show how moral discourse is deployed to consolidate both political power and to reshape democratic governance in Brazil. So, the convergence of contemporary radical right politics with issues of both gender and religion presents a complex scenario. It reflects a profound underlying issue of identity, power dynamics, and socio-political discourse across the globe. We see radical right parties, mostly driven by nativist and traditionalist views, increasingly weaving gender and religious rhetoric into their platforms. They use this rhetoric not only for political mobilization, but also as a tool, a cultural tool for constructing new social and moral norms. Despite the growing attention that these issues have been gathering, there have been few attempts to explore how they are connected and intertwined within the radical rights discourses and practices. So my purpose is to bridge this specific gap by exploring this, which I judge to be a high-profile case of Damares' advocacy for childhood issues in Brazil. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and I think Bernardo has already talked a lot about this, Brazil has witnessed this powerful rise and consolidation of a new radical right movement, which is distinguished by its seamless blending of conservative nationalism, religious fundamentalism, and reactionary gender politics. While this project goes beyond the figure of Bolsonaro, his administration between 2019 and 2022 significantly accelerated its power and traction and advanced a lot of policies that were deeply rooted in traditional family values and neo-Pentecostal moral principles. In this context, Alves is a central and enduring figure for the ideological shift we're witnessing. Her influence remains significant, not only because she is a federal senator, but also because she is a public religious figure who continuously shapes national debates around gender, family, and morality in the country. So I try to analyze how Alves is proposing a national project through the direct intersection of gender, religion, and politics, and by establishing herself as this leading voice in Brazilian radical rights. As I mentioned, the key source for this investigation is the analysis of her autobiography, taking this autobiography as a primary source for understanding her political message and how she's weaving both a personal narrative that helps to define, to align, and to frame the broader act of the radical right in Brazil. Ultimately, I highlight that Damares is using this faith-based personal narrative to present a deeply reactionary political project, which is not only an ideological choice, but is presented as a moral imperative, rooted in the protection, the sacred protection of Brazilian children. So, the contemporary rise of the radical right in Brazil has been marked by this convergence of regressive politics, religious fundamentalism, and reactionary gender ideology. I want to begin mostly by this part of my talk by analyzing a moment of Damares' inauguration in which she states, and now I'm quoting, "Boys wear blue while girls wear pink," end of quote. And I think that this seemingly simple statement, the delivered on her first day as a minister perfectly encapsulates her political project, a mission to reinforce conservative traditional gender roles backed by Christian morality and to reject what she terms gender ideology. Within this political landscape, Damares has consolidated herself as a key ideological figure since at least 2013. So it goes way back than the Bolsonaro government. Her career is defined by her new evangelical activism. She has worked as a pastor, as a lawyer, and has gained national recognition for her anti-abortion advocacy and her opposition to what we call gender ideology. In many ways, she is a pioneer in advancing this agenda in Brazil. When she was appointed minister in the then newly created Ministry of Women, Family and Human Rights in 2019, she became one of the most vocal but also popular members of the Bolsonaro administration. Her popularity in some periods of the government was higher than Bolsonaro's itself. So she has effectively reinforced the government's conservative stance on key social issues, promoting a series of initiatives that have strengthened traditional family structures, opposing comprehensive sexual education in schools, and defending religious freedoms under the guise of human rights. She has maintained a strong support among evangelicals and social conservatives, despite intense criticism from human rights groups and feminist organizations, and thus has secured her election as a federal senator in 2022. She consistently presents herself as a religious figure first, but she is, make no mistake, a very seasoned political operator. And she plays a crucial role in consolidating the radical right in Brazil, both as a policymaker, but also as a cultural influencer who translates these complex theological concepts into accessible political language to a large part of our population. So, to analyze Alves' autobiography, I have employed thematic analysis to systematically identify the core political and moral concerns that are embedded in her narrative. The book is wide-ranging, and it addresses issues from mental health to women's political participations and reproductive rights to pornography. But the overwhelming guiding theme, which is expressed in the title of the book, is a strong emphasis on childhood. So first, we should look at the foundational theme of childhood and social neglect. Alves begins by detailing her early years and immediately constructs a powerful thesis that many of Brazil's deep social problems stem from a societal and moral neglect of the youth. She attributes this neglect not just to policy failure, but to a theological failure within the Christian community to properly heed the biblical emphasis on child rearing. This concern is not just mentioned, it is reinforced by a rhetorical device, as she closes every chapter with the same striking phrases. As I've said, and I'm quoting, it all starts in childhood. This rhetorical choice makes it clear that the defense of children is her movement's highest moral priority. Next, the focus on children is used to frame the nuclear family as the single most foundational unity of the family. The national project that emerges from her book envisions a political community which is centered entirely in the protection of children as a biblical mandate. Within this framework, the nuclear heterosexual family is elevated as the essential foundational unity of Brazilian society. This unit, for her, must remain free from what she sees as intrusive state intervention, while simultaneously being deeply embedded in Christian community life. Crucially, she attempts to integrate this rigid ideal with contemporary dynamics. For instance, while she asserts that motherhood is a woman's most important role, she acknowledges that there might be different expressions of maternity, such as adoption, and discusses and even encourages how single, successful women might choose to adopt. And this, for those who know Damares, is a careful political maneuver to appeal both to modern female voters, but also to justify her own figure. She is a single mother who has adopted a child. So third, she also rejects feminism and the debate on reproductive rights. And she repeatedly emphasizes that she does not oppose women's autonomy or political participation. And she cites her own political success as a lawyer and a politician as evidence of the support for women's political participation and autonomy. Rather, she rejects feminism, which she portrays not only as a movement for equality, but an ideology that prioritizes women's rights at the expenses of children's well-being. And here she's mentioning specifically reproductive rights and abortions. She casts the entire debate not as political disagreement, but as a moral battle over the life of the unborn. Finally, we need to analyze her conceptualization of sexual orientation and gender identity. And she chooses to handle these topics by framing homosexuality not as an inherent characteristic, but as a symptom of social problems. Her claim is that most, and I'm quoting, homosexuals and travestites have experienced repeated sexual abuse, which directly implies that their identity are shaped by trauma rather than self-determination or natural variation. She also distinguished this from gender ideology, arguing that the latter is a dangerous political agenda that seeks to indoctrinate, confuse, and manipulate children in schools. By making this distinction, she successfully channels evangelical anxieties about child protection into political action against LGBTQ plus rights. To conclude this thematic look, we see that Alves' entire vision is cemented in her interpretation of the Bolsonaro president itself. She describes the 2018 election nothing less than a divine intervention, the answer to the prayers of persecuted Christians in Brazil. By reframing his controversial public persona through the lenses of religious redemption, specifically citing his marriage to an evangelical woman who sanctifies her husband, she reinforces his legitimacy among evangelical supporters and frames the entire administration as moral rather than just political. Now, to see how these themes function politically, we need to realize that the core argument here that I'm advancing is that Damares' autobiography is not really a memoir. It's a carefully crafted political document that strategically merges her personal narrative with ideological discourses. By sharing her life story, which is a story of and a personal narrative of resilience and religious conversion, Alves is doing two very smart things here. First, she's establishing herself as a moral authority, presenting her as a figure of piety and experience. But also, she's depoliticizing her agenda. When her conservative platform is framed as a personal moral mission to protect abused or neglected children, it becomes nearly impossible for opponents to criticize her on purely political or ideological grounds. And this has been, unfortunately, very effective in Brazil. So, this very smart rhetorical move is a key component of the Brazilian radical right. They present the political as the personal, and then the personal as the moral. Through her narrative, Alves manages to redefine the role of state itself. She argues that the state's main function is not to promote rights or equality, but to defend the traditional family unit and uphold Christian values. Her vision is rooted in this moral imperative. For her, issues like reproductive rights, sexual education, and gender identity are not matters of public policy debate, but are symptoms of a national moral crisis. And by doing so, she manages to mobilize this powerful emotional and moral capital of the new Pentecostal movement and direct it to support the radical right. So in essence, she is constructing a legislative blueprint for a Christian nation, where piety dictates policy. to summarize, Rebecca, in just a few points, I think what is most interesting about Damares is that she is emblematic of a profound ongoing social political transformation in Brazil, because we're witnessing at the same time not a decrease in religious affiliation, but actually a change, a decline of the Catholic dominance and an increase of new evangelical affiliation. And this is a fundamental transformation in the country's social political dynamics, which Damares is surfing and embodying very well. And she's both a product and a driver of this shift. And she's doing so very well established within our radical right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Safika, don't forget to introduce yourself. And I'll put the timer on and I'll wave at the end. Safika, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for all the presenters and Rebecca. I am Shefika Kumral, Assistant Professor of Sociology at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I will follow the order of presentations, and I want to start first with Edwin's paper. Edwin's analysis is very fresh. It brings a very fresh perspective to discussions of culture war that have intensified during the recent radical right upsurge in the United States. In contrast to culturalist explanations, the analysis highlights the class-based emergence of this distinct culture war blocks from 1960s onwards. And he focuses on most economic transformations and their impact on the two factions of the middle class and petty bourgeoisie. I think this distinction between material interests and the related cultural and ultimately political leanings of these sections of the middle class is both interesting and valuable. And even though I'm not going to go into detail about that, it, I think, also reflects similar, though contextually different polarizations of the middle classes in countries such as India, Turkey, and Israel. The identification of two middle classes and their diverging material interests as reflected in political parties and their respective positions in the culture war is particularly important in this analysis. However, how does this general analysis or the material interests that are reflected or the conflicts reflected in the culture war show that the interests of these two middle classes constitute the main factor in understanding the rise of Trumpism, or that Trumpism mainly represents not the white working class, but rather the white business owner in suburbia and rural America. I'm not arguing against this argument, but I am mainly trying to ask if you can expand on whether the material interests of different sections of the middle classes necessarily show us that we can understand the rise of this radical right surge in the US can emerge without winning a populist bloc based on based on like other groups besides the particular section of the petty bourgeoisie. After all, even within an explanation that places the middle classes or a particular segment of them at the center of a right-wing upsurge, how do their interests align or conflict with those of the bourgeoisie who also form part of the right-wing bloc, I think is essential. So I wanted to hear a little bit more regarding this. Another thing that I wanted to ask to Edwin and ask him to discuss is regarding the two parties. I wonder how his analysis might incorporate the two parties not as static entities, but as increasingly divided and transforming political actors. More specifically, how might within party divisions in both the Democratic and the Republican parties be taken into account in this overall discussion of divided petty bourgeoisie and their cultural material interests reflected in the culture wars. Do these parties still represent the same sections of the petty bourgeoisie since like 1960s, and how might the more populist factions within them, such as the Democratic Socialists and the Democratic Party and the MAGA in the within the Republicans, be integrated into this framework? And I think related to this point is about the more conceptual question of how bounded So because there's a criticism towards the culturalist framework about taking the cultural interests of certain blocs as bounded. How bounded are the interests of the petty bourgeoisie in this two different sections of the petty bourgeoisie in this case, since historically middle classes have been seen to like oscillate between different alternative ideologies. The same segments of petty bourgeoisie at a certain point joining middle working class mobilizations at a certain point shifting to fascist movement mobilization. So I also wanted to ask him whether these basically positions of different sections of the petty bourgeoisie are also like static. With that, I want to move on to the second presentation, to Bernardo's presentation. Bernardo provides a fascinating analysis of the personal and ideological history of Carvalho's rise from an obscure thinker to a major ideological symbol of the Brazilian right. And I think his analysis of Carvalho and his work demonstrates how right-wing ideologues have long identified this Gramscian revolution on the left, taking left seriously, particularly in the field of education, and how right-wing politicians have exploited that idea in their own culture wars. And despite his focus on Brazil, I think this argument has comparative historical and conceptual resonance beyond the case. And the analysis also itself mentioned also in a presentation, we heard how the contemporary attempts at construction of Gramscian style right. I also remember Cihan's earlier paper where he was talking about right-wing think tanks in the United States, basically following a Gramscian path while left had failed to do so. So this kind of, in general, reflects a more historical right-wing emulation of the left. After all, creating a counter-revolutionary mobilization, classical fascist parties have also emulated organizational elements of communist parties. So there's a similar kind of emulation of current rights of the contemporary left as a classic far right had done during interwar period. But the analysis of Carvalho's battle against Gramscism and the Brazilian far right's culture war, which is situated as a reaction to the left and to the limited reformism of the PT, raises some questions about the social basis of this ideological framework. So I want to hear more about what can we say about the social groups and classes with which this ideological framework resonates, and more specifically the social movements and organizations through which far right's culture war in Brazil is weaponized. And I think this is related to the paper's final argument that this far right intellectual direction is largely reactive, defined by opposition to the left rather than creating an alternative moral direction or hegemony. So is there really no active or positive, not in the sense of good, but positive active mobilization for alternative religious projects that go beyond this mere reactivity? After all, one of the things that I learned from this paper is that the fact that right took left seriously was one of the main reasons why they were successful. I wanted to ask whether there's any kind of positive agenda that this ideological framework puts forth, rather than being a mere reaction to left-wing hegemonic vacuum. Finally, I wanted to ask something that I'm quite interested in, the transnational links of the contemporary far right, or what some scholars are calling transnationalism. It might be beyond the scope of this paper, but the paper and the presentation also mentioned the general kind of links, the historical ideological affinities of to traditionalism from Guénon to Evola, which is kind of adopted to some extent by Dugin and Bannon. And I was wondering whether there are active kind of ideological and movement links that you observe right now, since we see very similar action repertoires, particularly in the domain of cultural wars that we observe across different countries. So I was wondering whether you can expand on that as well. For Cihan's paper, how much time do I have? Sorry.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, thank you so much. I don't want to go over time and to leave room for discussion. So Cihan's paper skillfully brings together structural Marxist accounts of fascism and world systems analysis to explain the escalation of violence in the Middle East as part of the global right-wing surge. I think one of the best things about his work is that it takes on the difficult task of integrating key structural and analytical, themes and frameworks while grounding them in rich historical contexts and tracing the evolution of specific regimes and movements. In doing so, I think the paper addresses a crucial and overarching question of whether we see a possible resurgence of fascism or the emergence of regimes that replicate core characteristics of classical fascism. And I also think that the papers focus or reliance on the definition of fascism, not only mainly as a movement and civic-based authoritarian regime type, characterized by constant mobilization of the masses and violence, is particularly useful for identifying fascistic regimes and for assessing the question of fascism resurgence in a Middle Eastern context right now. I have a question that is both conceptual and empirical at the same time. So when comparing the Israeli and Turkish regimes in terms of their deployment of violence, since the paper relies heavily on the concept of and the actual production of violence, I think this point becomes quite important. The paper argues that even though violence seems contained or circumscribed in Turkey, the violent energy is externalized. I agree with this point, especially compared to the current genocidal violence in Israel. The Turkish regime is less violent. And it is also true that Erdogan initially attracted some Kurdish electoral support and even initiated and still doing peace talks and negotiations. However, there has never been an complete hegemony over the Kurdish population, which is the main cause of the repeated top-down and bottom-up violence targeting the Kurds. In addition to periodic eruptions or anti-Kurdish riots, state-led top-down violence has been implemented by the regime. For instance, during 2015 urban insurgency in major Kurdish cities, we saw complete annihilation of certain kind of neighborhoods, even though compared to the other two cases, the civilian casualties were 300, but we saw displacement of over 300,000 people, which is also counted as ethnic cleansing in certain kind of definitions. And while these entire neighborhoods were demolished through combined military and paramilitary operations, we saw some scenes disturbingly similar to Gaza today. Quantitatively, not so, but qualitatively, and when we look at even the pictures, very similar. And as historical cases demonstrate, ethnic cleansing often unfold in cycles and spurts before culminating in full-scale genocidal violence. So the possibility of this culmination in Turkish context cannot be, I think, easily dismissed, and particularly in this case during the current peace talks, and since we don't know where they are going. And second thing is, relatedly, while the paper argues that the Syrian and Israeli regimes come closest to exhibiting fascist characteristics, the element of expansionism, a core feature of inter-war fascist regimes, is less fully discussed. It's there, but not less fully discussed. I was wondering what are the prospects for expansionist violence in the Syrian case, for instance, given its post-war reconstitution as a regime, compared with Turkey and Israel, both of which display regional hegemonic ambitions. And this also points to the broader link between external wars, internal violence towards others, as exemplified by the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, each of which occurred in the context of interstate wars. My final very quick question is, within fascism possessed certain organizational and mobilizational features that can be generalized, but it emerged as a unique political form rooted in particular historical conditions. It was a new political animal. So within this kind of analysis, I was wondering whether you see whether the new structural and political conditions give rise to this new form of fascism, and what implications does that have for our broader understanding of fascism contemporary manifestations? And finally, Tatiana's paper, which focuses on Brazil, highlights the, I think, broader and intriguing future of contemporary radical right. And since most, successful radical rights and fascist movements currently possess religious traditions and anti-feminist characters, and equally striking is the visible leadership and strong electoral support from women within these reactionary mobilization. As shown in the analysis, Damares frequently invokes her background of poverty and sexual abuse. And the analysis effectively demonstrates how her discourse attempts to present her stance as personal and moral rather than political, while it serves a deeply political character. So I was wondering whether this is particularly, whether this also kind of reflects how it resonates, basically. This discourse resonates with its ordinary women, since it's also just coming from, as you also mentioned in the paper, Pentecostal milieu, which now constitutes the majority among Brazil's poor population, which have been organizing for a long time among these neighborhoods. So how does basically this discourse, rather than a top-down only, constitution of a project, resonate with women she claims to represent, and what are the limits of it? And I want to also ask whether the childhood and youth emphasis is related to the anti-Gramscian basically war that Bernardo was talking about in his analysis, and to what extent it is basically utilized in this sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What I would like to do now is see if anybody from the audience has questions or comments, and let me collect those as a group, and then the panelists can respond sort of to everything at once. I know some people will have to go, but we can still capture it on the recording. So from the audience, are there questions, comments that people would like to ask our wonderful panelists? Lauren, do you want to go ahead, and other people just raise your hand and we'll just take a queue of questions?
Yeah, I guess I can be heard. I just want to comment on Ackerman's paper, which I've enjoyed very much because beginning with the fact that I've been a Marxist almost all my professional life, but I should qualify that a little bit in terms of the question of fascism. I work primarily in the tradition of the Frankfurt School. And part of the pioneering interest of the Frankfurt School was the rise of fascism. And one of the two important things, they basically argued that it was almost entirely, but largely a lower middle class phenomenon. And whether it was or not, I don't know, because there's a lot of other evidence of voting for the Nazi Party that wasn't quite. I forgot the guy who did that stuff. Maybe Ackerman knows that the distribution was much wider beyond the lower middle class. But the other thing that was important that hasn't been mentioned in any of the papers, well, slightly in terms of the Brazilian case, and I've been to Brazil many times. Yo falo Portuguese, but I'm not going to do that now. Well, not much Portuguese, but I can speak a little bit because I'm fluent. It's not fluent, but I can speak Spanish. Anyhow, the importance of the social psychological, primarily at that time, it was primarily in terms of authoritarianism. Now, since I'm not giving a paper, I won't go into the expansion of that, but there are very fundamental differences in the character structure between the people that support right-wing authoritarian movements and left-wing progressive movements. And most of the main thing here is the level of submission to authority and aggression and anger and things like that. I could go on and on, but this is a very important axis that separates that even within any of these classes. Now, if we update the argument that the Frankfurt School made, and I would assume that Ackerman is familiar with Toscano's recent book that argued that fascism in the 20s was a movement against the socialist parties. Well, those of us in the United States know that the Socialist Party would be about the size, a Socialist Party in America is about the size of our average classrooms, and it's irrelevant. But the motivation is against immigrants, against all of these bitchy, feminist women like all of you, my wife, et cetera, against homosexuals. I have a reason for that, but I don't waste too much time talking about that. But there is a political economic basis. So with Ackerman, I strongly admire the fact that we tie it to the political economy. But part and parcel of the tying it to the political economy does have to go back historically. Racism begins in the early 1600s with the necessity of dehumanizing the African Americans. Feminism is not simply a matter of contemporary women, but maintaining the subordinate position of women in the economy. I could go on, but I talk too much and I won't anymore. Anyhow, I do think that we really have to be a little bit broader. I want to finish with one thing, and I think Ackerman will know this study. It was a big study done at my alma mater, University of Chicago. It was done by a political scientist named Pape, Robert Pape. And this was an analysis of the 1,600 or so men that were arrested, men and a few women that were arrested at the after the January 6th. And about half of the people that were arrested, half of them were not even from the lower middle classes. They were from the upper middle classes. These were doctors, lawyers, no sociologists, but doctors, lawyers, professional people, CFOs, CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. And the picture in his PowerPoint that is so telling, he has a picture of a woman with an American flag hitting a bunch of police officers. He has another picture of the woman in her work uniform. She teaches at Harvard University Medical School. This is not a person who's basically going to be facing any severe economic hardships. And the reason I know this is because my wife was on the faculty of the University of Illinois Medical School and never let me forget for a single day that she made more money than I did.
Do other people from the audience have questions? Buga, I see you turned on your camera. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do, but I can't find my video setting.
We can hear you and see.
Oh, okay, here we go.
Yeah, we're good.
Can you see me?
Yeah, we're good.
Perfect. Thank you. This is so fabulous in the sense that you realize how comparisons across the globe come up and show us patterns, some structural patterns that go, throughout. And in this case, what was fascinating for me, of course, is the intersection of the far right, at least its sort of weaponization and use of religion. As an ideology, that seems to be one prominent, theme I see, and the other one is the sort of weaponization of identity, be it, your gender, sexuality, and other things, and how those two are so significant in explaining the inequities and the sort of unequal, especially power relations that emerge. So I wanted maybe to see if you could all comment or think about how your paper relates to the other papers in relation to certain themes going forward. Thank you. Just a comment and fabulous talks.
Just before we return to the authors, does anybody from the audience have any other questions for anyone? Comments? You can turn on your camera and I will see you, or you can wave your hand, or you can put your hand up. Okay, so I think I understand some people will have to go, but we can capture the author's responses. Edwin, I know you have to go. Do you want to just briefly go first and try to,
I'll try and be very succinct.
Do you want to try to sum all this up? You can go we'll go through the authors. Yeah.
I'll try and make just a couple of points here. The first question, the relationship with Trumpism and the rise to Trumpism. There is implicit in what I'm saying here a critique of the idea that his base is primarily the white working class. I think that misses several important dimensions of his basis of support. For example, if you look at voter turnout rates differentiated by class, you see that over the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century, to put it simply, the working class is sort of gradually out of the picture in terms of voting rates. That is, while there can still be obviously a case to be made of the specific way in which he mobilizes that class, they don't really increasingly constitute the bulk of the pro-Trump vote, right? Again, the working class is just basically abstaining at this point, exaggerating the point a bit, but more or less it stands empirically. And now there's a sort of mistake, I think, that we see often, particularly in journalistic accounts, of Trump support as being grounded in the working class, in the white working class, in that journalistic accounts often take manual labor, lack of college education, or even income levels as a proxy for working class. But if we take the definition in a more strict sense, and that is, the selling of labor power versus the ownership of means of production, many of those quote unquote manual laborers without college education are often independent contractors. This becomes, revealed as the sort of journalistic piece advances. You find that they are, small business owners, etc. Right? So there's a sort of precaution to be had, I think, around that account. And I do think, yeah, that the base of Trumpism is the traditional petit bourgeoisie. And I see his program, particularly the economic program, very clearly reflecting this, the sort of mix of protectionism that imagines it's protecting a sort of still existing national capitalism or national capital. Whether it does exist or not is sort of beside the point, because the discourse is about that sort of nostalgia of a national capital to be protected against a global capital. Now, so I see that playing out very clearly there. One thing I would add here that I would have liked to discuss a bit more in my presentation is that I see neoliberalism as producing, let's put it this way, creating militant petit bourgeoisies. That is, that the downward pressure in the move towards a service economy and towards the financialization and global capital puts downward pressure on both fractions of the petit bourgeoisie, and it increasingly, again, produces this sort of militant, even self-aware petit bourgeoisies. One last point to make here about intra-party divisions, which is very, very important to think through. I think the Republican Party leads its base more consistently because the traditional petit bourgeoisie is structurally more coherent. Whereas the new petit bourgeoisie has a sort of ambiguity built into it. Sometimes they're employees, sometimes they're self-employed. And this makes the Democratic coalition, I think, more unstable and internally contradictory. The question of DSA, I think, is really important here, very relevant, because interestingly enough, I think the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, is very explicitly aware that it has a problem of its membership being overwhelmingly composed of new petit bourgeoisie, or whatever new sort of downwardly mobile professional middle classes, as opposed to the working class in a classical sense, right? So it even comes to the point that the sort of relevance of those class fractions is I think at the edge of being explicitly acknowledged by some of the internal forces within these parties. Anyway, I'll stop there, but I thank you for the questions.
Thank you. Do our other authors want to respond? Cihan?
We can go by last name order again. If Bernardo wants to go first, I'll let him go first.
Okay, it's fine for me. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Sefka for her comments. They were really good. I think there are the main points, the main problems of my presentation. while Edwin was talking, was even thinking, well, how can I talk? I'm not talking about the social basis of the Brazilian far right, but of course, it's true. If I took Olavo de Carvalho as my subject, so it would be really difficult to do something as that, taking Olavo de Carvalho as from where I would develop my discussion. If you think about Olavo de Carvalho, of course, his books, probably his books were not that important, but even his work in the internet, thinking about like the repercussion that they had, everything, it was basically what you could call broadly of a middle class public that would read it and use it. But if, on the other hand, and even thinking more of on a Gramscian basis, you could think about kind of a historical bloc being formed by Bolsonarismo, no? And probably that would take part, what probably would take part of this bloc would be the agribusiness sector. Of course, it's not only class, and you could think also about evangelicals, as Tatiana would remarked, and evangelicals in Brazil, as I think also in the US, tend to be poorer than the average population, and also in a sense military are part of this group. What might be even more interesting is thinking about the Brazilian electoral map. That if you could look at where Fernando Henrique Cardoso party, PSDB, which began as a center-left party, it's called the Party of the Brazilian Social Democracy, but went to the right during time. Basically, the states where Fernando Henrique and his party used to win now vote for Bolsonaro, né? Like São Paulo and Rio Grande do Sul, né? Both of the states. But it's more complicated, of course, it's not that simple. But there are other questions, and I'll just talk of them very briefly. One are the international links of the far right thinking about Brazil. There are links, but there's also kind of a direct inspiration in what the Brazilian far right does, using the US as a model. And it's kind of funny, even if you talk about nationalism. Bolsonaro, when he was elected in 2018, in his ads, free ads in Brazilian television, you have, he used to pledge the allegiance to the flag of the USA, which is really weird for nationalism. And now, of course, this is very the moment with Lula and Bolsonaro being judged, even with his condemnation by the Supreme Court. Like, I don't know if you saw, but there were mass manifestation of the far right with the U.S. flag present also, which is very weird, and I can't really develop. But my main point is really the problem of hegemony. If there is really an hegemony, and I really think there's not an hegemony, even if you think of both sides, this far right or even globally, I think. It's more a reaction probably to the moment we're living, kind of a crisis of neoliberalism. And even if you think about the left in Brazil, PT, what you could say that we really have is this weak reformism. So in the end, I would say that we were really living through an interregnum, and it's very hard to see directions. Even what Cihan talked about in an international level, like thinking about there's no hegemon capable of establishing. I think that's another sign of this more general situation. But it's where my points I would like to make really fast. Really. So, thanks again.
So I guess I'm going next. Okay, yeah, thank you for all these great presentations and questions. I loved both the questions and the other presentations, and I'll have to restrict my comments But let me start with some responses to Edwin's presentation and the questions that followed about it. I really want to invite everybody to think more in terms of articulations rather than is it class or is it ethnicity or is it gender. I see these forces as being at their best in terms of their own projects when they articulate the ethnic, religious, gender, and class grievances and projects. And if you look at Brazil and the US and partially Israel too, working classes are mobilized mostly as ethnic and religious subjects and not enough as class subjects. So that marks a great weakness, like the great underbelly of the far right in America, Brazil, and partially Israel. Whereas in Turkey, Hungary, India, working classes are also recognized as workers. So there is class articulation as much as maybe most in Turkey and Hungary, more than India. There's a class articulation as well as ethnic, racial, religious, and gender articulation, which makes these cases much sturdier and more resilient than their Brazilian and American counterparts. And I think a big part of the reason for this is the strength of some certain capitalist fractions. So as much as these new petit bourgeois fractions, which we should be paying attention to, I think we should be paying more attention to the capitalist class fractions and why they can't organize themselves in hegemonic ways in Brazil and the US, and why they are able to do so in Hungary and Turkey and partially Israel and India. But I don't have to go into the whys of that, but I think it's very obvious that this is the case. You know, these fractions are more successful in self-organization and the organization of rest of society in Turkey and Hungary. So regarding Shefika's questions about the Turkish case, I agree with her that I'm kind of down emphasizing the violence in Turkey. I mean, there is serious violence in Turkey, but I was just speaking comparatively. I mean, definitely there is more violence in Turkey when compared to the US and Brazil, but way less when compared to Israel and Syria. And I think a big part of this is that again, the capitalist class fraction that is organizing hegemony in Turkey was at least until 2024. I mean, post 2024, I'm way less certain. But until 2024, they did their best to be hegemonic, even in their relations to the Kurds. And I do realize I'm kind of bending the stick here. And yeah, I mean, for further details of how far I'm bending it, you can look at both Shefika's and my publications, and Shefika is doing a much better job of emphasizing the more fascistic aspects of the Turkish regime. So can any of these cases, Israel, Syria, Turkey, go a more expansionist way? I mean, they're all dying to, well, more in the cases of Israel and Turkey, but the world's systemic balances don't yet allow them to. But there are many actors within the Turkish and Israeli ruling blocs that want to be as expansionist as possible. So they have the potential to become more and more like interwar fascism. In Syria, regarding the Syrian regime, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, their promise is in the reverse direction. So they're promising the world hegemon, or the declining world hegemon in this case, that they're going to move away from Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they're going to be as little expansionist as possible, to such an extent that they're actually like ceding some part of their territory to Israel. So it's reverse expansionism, whatever the word for that is. So that's a very interesting dynamic. So yeah, I mean, my presentation was like very like comparative, historical in some regards, but I want to emphasize these field dynamics between the imperialists themselves. So that's very important, like what Syria does with respect to Israel and what Israel does with respect to Syria. So the last question, the historical novelty of all of this. I agree with Shefika in that we need to be like really, really careful in this use of the word fascism, even when we specify it and restrict it as like mass-based violent dictatorship. Even when we do that, this is not exactly interwar fascism. Especially when you look at how Al-Jolani, how Erdogan, how Netanyahu still uphold the parliament. The parliament is sacred in all of these cases. So that's very much unlike interwar fascism, where parliamentarianism was the enemy. Here it's not. I mean, they manipulate parliament, they distort parliament, they control parliament, yes, but it is ideally speaking, it's sacred for them, unlike the Nazis and the Italian fascists. And another dimension of this, which resonates with the parliamentarianism, is the individualism. I mean, all of these are like very neoliberal individualist fascists, right? I mean, they all have way more Friedmanian, Hayekian sensibilities when compared to interwar fascists. So in Turkey, I have argued that we need a new term for this, and I have called it democratic authoritarianism. But I don't think we can call it that in Syria or Israel. I mean, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Likud bloc. They are way closer to interwar fascism than what I have called democratic autocracy in my article in Historical Materialism. And I'll stop there. I mean, I have more thoughts, but I want to leave some space for other comments and responses from the panelists.
Tatiana, would you like to comment?
Yes, very quickly, Rebecca. I know we're running out of time, so I don't want to take a lot of space. Just thanks, Shefika, for her questions and for such a careful reading of the papers. And I would say that yes, Damares resonates very much with ordinary women in Brazil, mostly because I think she provides a faith-based version or vision of what women empowerment could be. And the faith component for this is very interesting and very strategic, especially when we consider how religious the Brazilian population still is, right? And then she's making this stark contrast with more progressive feminist discourse, which is usually understood as being an elite concern by the Brazilian working class. And then I think she manages very well to mobilize lower income evangelical women. I was thinking about your question, and if I had to break down her strategy, I would say she's trying to elaborate this rags to riches survivor narrative of a woman who has success in a men's world, but is able to remain very feminine, very close to traditional Christian values and morals. She remains feminine. And so she positions herself as being pro-women while anti-feminist. And in that sense, just moving quickly to your second consideration of the anti-Gramscian or Gramscian fascination of the Brazilian radical right, I've never read, she doesn't obviously say anything about this, although she criticizes cultural Marxism a lot during her book. But I think she fashions herself as an organic intellectual, right? As someone who rose from the masses and is being successful in translating her theological beliefs into political programs and making, in her view, a positive change in society. So I would say this is interesting, but it's just something that came up while listening to you and to the other panelists. I've never read anyone exploring this idea, so perhaps I'm leaving the panel with a new hypothesis. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Let's give everybody a big round of applause. Thank you for coming. Please consider joining our Global Critical Studies and Praxis Network. It's in the chat. If you were late, just shoot me an email. And we're looking forward to more of these events. And we'll post the recording online as soon as I figure out how to do that. Thanks again, everyone.